one that begins in the darkest days of World War II and ends among the stars. In an era when SpaceX launches and Elon Musk's visions of Mars fill our imaginations, it's hard to believe that the roots of modern rocketry trace back to a single terrifying weapon from World War II. This is the story of the V-2 rocket, Germany's fearsome vengeance weapon that paradoxically paved the way for the space race and all the rockets that came after. Now, take a deep breath, dim the lights, and get comfortable. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine it's late 1944 and you're walking through the streets of London on a chilly morning. The war has been raging for years, but on this day, the sky is clear and quiet. Suddenly, without warning, the ground shakes violently. A thunderous explosion blasts through the air a split second before you hear anything at all. Windows shatter. Bricks and dust fill the street. People are stunned, unsure what even hit them. You've just witnessed the terrifying power of a V-2 rocket. Unlike previous bombing raids, there were no sirens, no drone of enemy aircraft engines overhead. The V-2 struck completely silently and without warning, traveling faster than the speed of sound. Only after it exploded would you hear the eerie double crack of its sonic boom. It's a weapon straight out of science fiction for the people of 1944, a rocket that comes screaming out of the edge of space to rain destruction from above. The V-2 rocket of World War II was no ordinary bomb. It was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile, a single-stage rocket powered by liquid fuel, Nazi technology far ahead of its time. Nazi Germany called it Vergeltungswaffe 2, meaning vengeance weapon 2. It was intended as vengeance for Allied bombings of German cities, a way to terrorize civilians in return. Standing over 14 meters tall, about 46 feet, and carrying a 1-ton explosive warhead, the V-2 roared into the sky on a pillar of flame. At full thrust, its engine burned a mix of liquid oxygen and ethanol. Yes, alcohol, essentially 100-proof booze, diluted so the soldiers wouldn't be tempted to drink the rocket fuel. This fiery concoction could hurl the rocket to an altitude of 50 to 100 kilometers above the Earth. In fact, in one test flight in June 1944, a V-2 reached the edge of space, becoming the first human-made object to ever cross the Kármán line, the 100-kilometer boundary that defines outer space. World War II science had inadvertently launched humanity's first spacecraft, even as it was being used to wage war. But in 1944, the Germans weren't aiming for space. They were targeting cities. From September 1944 until the war's end in 1945, over 3,000 V-2 rockets were launched against Allied targets. The main targets were London, which endured a renewed nightmare of explosions falling from the sky, and later cities like Antwerp and Liège. To those on the ground, the V-2 was a terrifying weapon. There was no effective defense against it. No fighter aircraft could intercept it in time, and anti-aircraft guns were useless against a missile that dropped from the stratosphere at supersonic speed. For the first time in history, an attack could come ballistically from beyond the atmosphere. People in London would later recall that you never knew a V-2 was coming until it hit. One moment you're sipping your tea, the next, a building down the street erupts in flames. If you heard the explosion, you were lucky. it meant you survived it. This psychological terror factor was exactly what Nazi propaganda hoped for. Even British Prime Minister Winston Churchill grimly noted that the V-2 bombardment was a frightening new form of warfare, though thankfully it came too late to save Nazi Germany from defeat. Indeed, as advanced as the V-2 rocket was, it proved to be more of a terror weapon than a war-winning one. The project had been astronomically expensive and complex, diverting resources late in the war, when Germany was already on the brink of collapse. Each V-2 carried a hefty price tag and required a small army of technicians and support staff to transport, fuel, and launch it. The missiles were fueled in the field with cryogenic liquid oxygen that had to be handled carefully, and the guidance system, a crude analog computer with gyroscopes, often wasn't very accurate. Many V-2s veered off course or had mechanical failures. Those that did hit their targets caused devastation, but compared to the massive Allied bombing raids with thousands of conventional bombs, the V-2's impact was militarily limited. It was terror on a personal scale, terrifying if you were in its path, but not enough to turn the tide of war. By early 1945, as Allied troops closed in, Germany kept firing V-2s more out of spite and desperation. The last V-2 struck London in March 1945, mere weeks before the war in Europe ended. Yet the legacy of the V-2 would far outlast the Third Reich. As the war ended, the world's superpowers realized that the technology behind this rocket could revolutionize future warfare and even exploration. The origins of the space race and the Cold War arms race were directly tied to the scramble for the V-2. In the final days of World War II, Allied forces raced each other to capture German rocket sites, designs, and personnel. The V-2 launch facilities and production plants were prime targets. Teams from the United States, the Soviet Union, and Britain were all searching for pieces of this advanced rocket puzzle. They combed through laboratories, underground factories, and even test ranges to find intact rockets or documents. In one dramatic episode, a unit of American soldiers arrived at a secret underground V-2 factory called Mittelwerk in central Germany. What they found was shocking. Miles of tunnels filled with partially assembled rockets and components, the remnants of the Nazi rocket program. This was a grim place. The V-2s had been built here by thousands of slave laborers under horrific conditions. Tragically, more people died from the conditions in these tunnels through starvation, disease, and brutality than the V-2 rockets themselves killed in London and other cities. It's a sobering reminder that even great scientific achievements can cast a long shadow when forged in cruel circumstances. The Americans gathered up as much V-2 hardware as they could. About 80 intact V-2 rockets were captured, along with engines, technical documents, and parts. Equally important, many of the top German rocket scientists and engineers surrendered to the U.S. forces. Among them was the mastermind of the V-2 program himself, Wernher von Braun. Von Braun was a young aerospace engineer, brilliant and ambitious. He had dreamed of building rockets to explore space ever since he was a teenager, fascinated by science fiction and the idea of traveling to other planets. In fact, it was said that von Braun's true passion was space travel, not weaponry. But under the Nazi regime, he had channeled his rocketry expertise into creating this weapon because that's where the funding and urgency were. Now, with Germany defeated, von Braun and his team saw an opportunity to continue their work, hopefully for more peaceful ends. The U.S. military was very eager to bring in this trove of knowledge. In a secret effort known as Operation Paperclip, they transported hundreds of German scientists, including von Braun, to America, effectively recruiting the brains behind Nazi Germany's rocket program to work for the United States. On the other side, the Soviet Union was doing the same. Soviet engineers and intelligence units seized the main V-2 manufacturing plant and many components in eastern Germany. They captured some German rocket experts as well, though a number of the top minds had gone west to surrender to the Americans first. Still, the Soviets got enough to kickstart their own missile program. In the years immediately after World War II, this competition quietly unfolded. Both the US and the USSR were testing captured V-2 rockets and training their own teams in this new rocket science. At a desert test range in New Mexico, American engineers, now joined by von Braun's group, launched reassembled V-2s to study their performance. These early American V-2 test launches in 1946 and 1947 were not aimed at enemies, but at the sky itself. They carried scientific instruments, examined high-altitude conditions, and even took the first photographs of Earth from space by attaching a camera that snapped pictures from over 100 kilometers up. Imagine the wonder of those early experiments. A grainy black and white photo showing the Earth's curvature, clouds, and land far below, taken by a repurposed weapon, now acting as a tool of exploration. It was a glimpse of the future. Meanwhile, the Soviets, under the guidance of their own chief designer, Sergei Korolev, and with help from German engineers in the beginning, built their first missiles based heavily on the V-2's design. The Soviet R-1 rocket was essentially a clone of the V-2, tested by the late 1940s. They quickly iterated on that design to make more powerful rockets. The Americans did likewise. Von Braun and his team developed the Redstone rocket, which was basically an improved, longer-range V-2. By the early 1950s, what had begun as the V-2 had evolved into a new generation of ballistic missiles, and these rockets were no longer just experimental. They became central to national defense. Both superpowers realized that long-range rockets could deliver nuclear warheads across oceans in minutes, and thus the Cold War technology race for missiles was on. The frightening specter of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, had its genesis in the V-2. Yet amid the rivalry and the military buildup, there was another race forming. The space race origins were rooted here as well. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into orbit. What rocket did they use to do it? It was the R-7, a direct descendant of the technology that began with the V-2. The R-7 was much bigger and more powerful, but many of its foundational design principles, multi-stage propulsion, guidance systems, high-speed re-entry, were extensions of that first German rocket blueprint. Not to be outdone, the United States made its own push for space. In 1958, the U.S. launched its first satellite, Explorer 1, using a Jupiter C rocket, another descendant of the V-2 lineage, designed in part by Wernher von Braun's team. In a poetic way, Wernher von Braun, who had once built the V-2 for Nazi Germany, was now helping America shoot for the stars. He became a central figure in NASA's early space programs. A little over a decade later, von Braun's team would design the mighty Saturn V rocket that sent Apollo astronauts to the moon in 1969, perhaps the most iconic rocket in history, and a direct spiritual successor of that early V-2. It's astonishing how the threads connect. The Saturn V that launched men to the moon could trace its engineering ancestry back to the crude but groundbreaking V-2 that roared off a German launch pad in the 1940s. So how did a weapon of war end up launching the space age? It happened in steps, and not without moral complexity. The V-2 was born in a time of desperation and cruelty. It was built by an oppressive regime, using captive labor, intended to cause fear and destruction. And yet, the knowledge gained from it did propel humanity forward. After the war, many of the people involved struggled with the weight of that history. Wernher von Braun, for example, rarely spoke about the moral compromises of his time in Germany, but he often spoke about his dream of exploration. In the post-war era, he essentially reframed himself not as a weapons maker, but as a rocket scientist pursuing humanity's oldest dream, reaching for the stars. This narrative was convenient and inspiring to the American public during the Cold War, and largely true in terms of his personal passion, even if the darker aspects of the V-2 program were glossed over. The same rocket equations that guided a V-2 to London were now guiding spacecraft to orbit and beyond. If we look up at the night sky today, filled with satellites and space stations, or watch a live feed of a Falcon 9 rocket smoothly landing itself on a drone ship, feats that seem so futuristic, we should remember that it all started with very humble and harrowing beginnings. The modern rockets making headlines owe a debt to that first big leap in rocketry technology. The Nazi V-2 rocket demonstrated what liquid fuel rockets could do, and in doing so, it opened the door to space. It showed that it was possible to build a machine that could breach Earth's atmosphere. Once that door was opened, scientists and engineers around the world rushed through it. First, out of military necessity, then for scientific curiosity, and eventually for human exploration. In a sense, the V-2 was the first stage of a much longer journey that we're still on today. Now, reflecting on this history, there's a bittersweet quality to it. It's remarkable to think that something so destructive laid the groundwork for something so inspiring. World War II technology gave us not only the means for great devastation, like the atomic bomb and ballistic missiles, but also spurred leaps in innovation that would later benefit mankind, like jet aircraft, radar, and of course, rockets for space travel. The V-2 program sits right at that intersection of terror and progress. Without it, the space race might have been delayed by many years. With it, however, came a legacy that scientists had to morally reckon with. Could the exploration of space be somehow a redemption for the horrors of war? Many, including von Braun, perhaps saw it that way, that turning swords into plowshares or missiles into launch vehicles was a path forward for humanity. As we wind down our journey tonight, think about how far rocket science has come in the 80 years since the V-2 first streaked through the sky. That early rocket was unguided by modern standards, essentially aimed at a general target and let loose. It often broke apart or failed. It could only be used once and was horribly expensive. Today, we have rockets that can be guided with incredible precision by computers, even brought back down to land softly and be used again. Companies like SpaceX are pushing the envelope of what rockets can do, planning missions to Mars and beyond. And yet, the basic physics and the bold mindset that we can shoot something into space remains the same as in 1944. In the Elon Musk era of fascination with rockets, when we cheer at each new innovation, it's worth remembering the journey that got us here. The rockets lighting up the sky today are the great-great-grandchildren of the V-2. History has a funny way of weaving progress out of even the darkest events. So next time you gaze at the moon or see a bright dot moving across the night sky, perhaps the space station or a satellite, remember that it all truly began with a lone rocket built amid a world war. The rocket that started the space age. From the devastation of World War II, science came the launch pad to the stars. It's a story that shows how intertwined our innovations and our history really are. Now, let your mind drift gently, picturing that first rocket arching into the night sky over Europe all those years ago, and the long chain of rockets ascending ever since. From Vengeance, weapon, to moon rocket, to Mars spacecraft. What a journey. Sleep well, and dream of how, even from the ashes of war, humanity can find its path to the heavens.